I want to defend today two theses. One is exegetical, and it states that it is impossible to understand Arriaga's views on life, who had quite a career in the secondary literature, without taking Hurtado into account. And the second thesis is, you could say, historiographical. Any theory of life in the early modern period must account both for life within nature and for the life of spiritual substances. And from the second thesis, you can derive a consequence, namely that any account of life must answer two questions, even if they are not always clearly separated in the texts. They are two different, you could say, dimensions of the problem of life. Namely, the first, how to distinguish changes in organisms from changes in inanimate substances. And the second, how to find a concept of life that is applicable both to mere organisms, most notably plants, and spiritual substances, in particular God. And I will trace these questions through both editions of Hurtado's cursus, and in the first edition of Arriaga's cursus, there are substantial changes if you compare the last edition of Arriaga's cursus with the first, but these span almost 40 years, and I have a list of, I think, about 20 references between 1632, the first edition of Arriaga, and 1669, the last edition of Arriaga, dealing with these problems, and I still have to read this stuff. So Arriaga 1632 is the endpoint today. Hurtado in 1615. Hurtado does not require participation in or correspondence with the divine life as the most perfect form of life, as a criterion of life. In this, he distances himself from the tradition, most notably from Suarez. His requirement is weaker. We need a common ground of life that covers all cases of being alive. What is then the common ground of life in God and plants? One candidate, defended, I think, by Thomists, is change from within. But this poses a problem because God is immutable. That is, he is not subject to natural change at all. But then he is not capable of natural change from within either. This means that we must look for another common ground of life within plants and God, and Hurtado's suggestion is having a perfection from within. In God, this perfection from within is realized without natural change, local motion, while in plants it is realized through such natural changes. Hurtado uses perception as an example for illustrating this abstract claim. Perception in created living beings involves a natural change, namely a change in a sense organ. God perceives without such changes, namely without sense organs, but perception has in both cases nevertheless a common ground, namely the object of perception. In a similar way, Hurtado holds that life thus also, I mixed here up a line. Perception thus has a common ground in man and God, the object, and Hurtado now surmises that you can apply this conceptual structure to the analysis of life in general. Plants live through natural changes, but it is not the changes themselves that are the ground of life, but the fact that these changes are a perfection. God lives without natural changes, but still his life is a perfection as well. So to briefly summarize Hurtado's position in 1615, he conceptualizes the investigation of the life of plants and its relation to the life of God as the search for a common ground of life. Change from within cannot be such a common ground because God is immutable, but both for plants and God, vital acts are a perfection from within. This then is the common ground of life in much the same way as an object of perception is the common ground of perception in both God and other sentient beings. In 1624, Hurtado embeds his views in a different dialectical structure. He discusses one argument against plants being alive that is missing from the earlier version. The argument claims that there is no predicate that applies to both plants and God as far as their being alive is concerned. The only possible candidate would be having intellect and will. But this clearly does not apply to plants. Conversely, God has no nutritive vital functions that are present in plants. The only reason to ascribe life to God is that he cognizes, as do humans. So the common ground for the ascription of life to God and humans is cognition. The common ground of life to humans and plants is nutrition. But there exists no such common denominator for God and plants. It is in the context of this stronger requirement for a commonality of grounds between plants and God with regard to life that Hurtado quotes explicitly an argument that will reappear in the first edition of Arriaga's Cursus 8 years later. But Hurtado, I can already say that, does not accept this argument, but it does appear already in 1624, although it is adopted by Arriaga 8 years later. The argument distinguishes two forms of life, physical life and intentional life. Physical life consists in physical change, intentional life in cognition and effects. In other words, life is equivocal when applied to plants and God or other spiritual substances. This distinction is meant to save the notion that plants are alive, even though life in their case means something different than in the case of the life of God. For Hurtado, the question is, however, whether this refutation concedes too much. There is not much won if the term life is applied to plants and God only equivocally. This seems to be not so much a defense of the thesis that plants are in a meaningful sense alive, than rather as a cop-out, at least with regard to the question how an eventual life of plants compares to the life of spiritual substances. Hurtado believes in 1624 that this cop-out is not necessary. Perfection from within is shared by plants and God. God and plants then have more in common than an inhabitant of France and a rooster, which are in Latin both called gallus, and who thus share only the term used to refer to them. Gallus does not denote a genus that could be divided into species, because there are no constitutive traits for such a genus that would be shared by men and roosters. But vivens is in this sense logically divisible, because God and plants share perfections from within. From a logical point of view, God and a stone only agree with regard to being both substances. God and plants agree with regard to be living substances. Hurtado's conception of the common ground of life as a perfection from within leads in 1624 to a consequence that some may regard as counterintuitive. Since intellection and volition are not the only perfections to be found in God, all divine attributes must be understood as a ground for the ascription of life to God. Hurtado claims that this is also implied in the position of those who defend the distinction between vita physica and vita intentionalis as a viable strategy to counter those negating the life of plants. Any argument for plants being alive must rely on some non-accidental difference between plants and inanimate substances. Else, the whole question whether or not plants are alive would be merely an empty dispute about words. Alioquin tota quaestio est voce. So, as soon as we accept that augmentation or nutrition and the endpoint, the fully grown individual, are not fully dependent on an external source, we must also accept that their counterpart in God, omnipotence, is an expression of life too. Hence, the perfection of both does not completely depend on external factors, as is the case for inanimate substances. So those who, like Arriaga, defend the notion of physical life as being based on change from within must also accept that physical life is analogous to divine omnipotence, so that for them too, divine omnipotence must count as an attribute that is part of God's life. Else, they would have to assume that the difference between animate and inanimate changes in nature is purely verbal. Hurtado summarizes, and I quote, "Hence, if there is in this case in God neither physical nor intentional change, this proves that life has been divided by some in a useless fashion. God has other perfections from within besides intentional change, in which he is dissimilar from the stone, and in which the plant is similar to him with regard to some predicates shared by all living things and belonging to vital change, but not shared with stones. Therefore they, the perfections, fixate determinate limits of the concept of life." So, for Hurtado, the distinction of physical and intentional life fails because it does not provide a true ground of life shared by plants and God. And it neglects the fact that it is not only intellection and volition that contribute to the life of God, but that he lives through all of his attributes. Hurtado's final objection against the distinction of physical and intentional life makes explicit an important hidden assumption of his view. It seems to be attractive because the life of plants seems to be more dependent on interaction with other substances than God's life, that is, so to speak, self-contained. Hurtado believes that this conviction is misguided. God's cognition is not less from the outside, minus extrinsicus, than the process of nutrition in a plant, presumably because both require an external factor, namely the object in the case of God's cognition, and nutrients in the case of the nutrition of a plant. Conversely, God's omnipotence has the same degree of internality as God's cognition. Est tam ab intrinsico quam cognitio Dei. It has therefore also the same degree of internality as the nutrition of plants. There is just a transitive relation here. A is identical to B, B is identical to C, so C is identical to A. Both cognition in the case of God and nutrition in the case of plants depend on external objects. To have a property that comes from within is thus a property shared by God and plants, but absent in stones. Insofar as all divine attributes are equivalent with regard to their degree of internality, it is obvious that then, quote, all of God is, according to our argument, life. I summarize. Hurtado claims that we should not look for any correspondence of capabilities in different kinds of living things, but that we search a common ground for the description of life in all cases, perfections from within. The notion that life is grounded in change from within is untenable because God is immutable. This may lead some who want to preserve change as the ground of life to the conclusion that grounds of life are incommensurable for plants and God. Their distinction of physical and intentional life is, however, untenable. Both plants and God are truly alive. They are part of the same genus of living things as it can be distinguished from inanimate substances. Moreover, as soon as we accept that the distinction between living and non-living substances is real, we are committed to ascribe life to both created living substances and God, because any characterization of something as being truly alive must implicitly rely on an analogy to divine attributes, analogy in a non-terminological sense. I should hasten to add in the light of previous presentations. Conversely, every divine attribute is an expression of divine life because all attributes are perfections from within, sharing the same degree of internality. To deny that something is in this sense alive reduces the whole problem of finding a common ground of life for plants and God to a quibble about words. Arriaga in 1632. Hurtado's student Arriaga disagrees with his teacher in fundamental regards. There is no common ground for the ascription of life to plants and to spiritual substances, because life in plants, the physical life, is characterized by specific vital acts that are distinct from other immanent changes in inanimate substances. And he believes that Hurtado's identification of such a common ground namely perfection from within, is fallacious, because the notion of a ground must be understood causally. But with regard to the causal dimension, perfections of God and perfections of plants are incommensurable, because perfections in God are uncaused, while perfections in plants are self-caused. First, on Arriaga, on the physical and intentional life. In his analysis of how to conceptualize the relation between the life of plants and the life of God, Arriaga mentions his teacher only once by name. But already in the exposition of the problem how to relate the life of God and the life of plants, he disagrees with Hurtado. While Hurtado had maintained that the problem of the life of plants is not merely linguistic, Arriaga says the precise opposite. Quote, I have stated a bit earlier that this question, whether plants are alive, is for the most part about the word life. While I show this, I explain at the same time the whole problem and expound clearly what to think in this matter. Arriaga concedes that the distinction between immanent and transient, or as he calls them, intrinsic and extrinsic changes is real. There is a real difference between acts that do and those which do not transcend the substance causing them, their principle. An act of the intellect does not transcend the mind, animus. If fire causes my hand to warm, this effect transcends the principle of warmth, that is, the fire. But in theory, we would be free to choose whether we call immanent acts vital or transient ones. Nothing in what constitutes the difference between both kinds of acts gives us any factual argument for this decision. This question is merely linguistic. Quaestio est de sola voce. But then the most reasonable strategy is to appeal to the common use of the term in question. Most people reserve the term living for those things that are predominantly capable of immanent acts, among them plants, and do not apply the term to stones, water, or other beings. But for Arriaga, not all immanent actions are thereby vital acts. Acts that contribute to the evolution of a thing according to its form are not vital acts. Such immanent changes that contribute to the realization of the nature of a thing are, in Arriaga's terminology, constituting a thing in its being according to nature, esse connaturale, or its being how it should be, esse debitum. This class of changes concerns changes according to and caused by the form or essence of the thing in question. Arriaga refers to water regaining its original frigidity, the movement of light bodies upwards or heavy bodies downwards as exemplifications of such a principle. Then there are changes that are not the realization of an essential form, that is, changes that are contingent insofar as they can or cannot happen. The intellect is not always thinking. An animal is not continuously growing until the end of its life. But man is not in a counter-natural, violent state if he is not thinking or nourishing himself, as long as this does not contribute to a corruption of his overall being. Arriaga suggests to call only this kind of immanent change vital. It should be noted, however, that this concerns only what he calls later the physical life of organisms and has no implications for the intentional life of spiritual substances. So Arriaga seems to believe that it is helpful to distinguish between two kinds of changes in a living being. Some changes are part of the normal developmental process of a living thing and may be indistinguishable from non-living things developing according to their form, like fire. Others are not part of the nature of the thing in question and do not necessarily count towards a realization of its form because they are contingent, can or cannot happen within the ordinary course of nature. It is in the context of an objection to this distinction between vital and non-vital immanent acts that Arriaga introduces this distinction between physical and intentional life. The objection concerns the proper conceptualization of angelic life. It is commonly assumed that angels live through cognition. This means that the very first moment of their existence must be a thought. Because without this thought, they would not exist. Thus, the very first thought of an angel is connatural, or an act that should be, cognitio sibi debita. But at the same time, the very life of an angel consists in thinking and willing and nothing else. Therefore, the life of an angel is a counterexample to Arriaga's thesis that only acts that are not connatural and do not need to exist should count as vital acts. It is against this distinction that Arriaga urges his thesis of the two forms of life. Intentional life consists in cognition and desire and does not presuppose that a thing has already realized all possibilities that are latent in its nature, so that a substance that lives the intentional life need not be constituted in its connatural being. It is no res constituta in suo esse connaturali. The distinction between acts that are owed to the connatural being of a substance and those which are not thus concerns only the physical life. The objection that angels live connaturally from the very first moment of their existence is thus in fact proof of their living only the intentional life. But it does not concern the life of plants, which is physical. Here the distinction between vital and non-vital natural changes holds. For the objection to be successful, we would need an example of a living thing that lives the physical life only through acts that are an expression of its nature. But such an example is not part of the objection. So, contrary to what we may expect and to what career this distinction has in authors after Arriaga, the distinction between physical and intentional life does not have central relevance for him. It rather serves to immunize his distinction between vital and non-vital immanent acts against the objection that this distinction is not applicable to spiritual substances. As I had mentioned before, Arriaga in 1632 mentions his teacher only once explicitly and expresses agreement with his views. However, the views of his teacher on the common ground of life in plants and God are sharply criticized, however, without explicit attribution. We can summarize his objections as follows. The very notion of a perfection from within is unintelligible. The notion of intrinsicality suggests a positive property, but it is in fact negative as far as God is concerned. It must be analyzed as stating that divine perfections are uncaused. Perfections of plants are not uncaused but self-caused. Therefore, both perfections are incommensurable. Arriaga paraphrases Hurtado correctly as claiming that both plants and God have a perfection from within, intellection and volition in the case of God, growth in the case of plants. Arriaga comments, "This reply seems to state something only as far as words are concerned, but nothing as far as the problem itself is concerned. Haec responsio solis verbis videtur aliquid dicere in re tamen nihil." The notion that God could have a perfection from within is for him unintelligible. It cannot mean that God conveys to himself or causes in himself a perfection. The seemingly positive term from within is in fact negative or limitative. It means not caused from the outside. According to Arriaga, this has two disastrous consequences. Firstly, Hurtado's unclear understanding of perfection dissolves the conceptual tie between God being alive and God being a thinking and willing being. Since life in the case of God means, patio Hurtado, to be in states that are uncaused, improductum, God would still be alive if he counterfactually was unable to think, love, or act in any other way, because he would still be an uncaused being. This goes against any established use of the predicate living. Conversely, if any part of non-living nature, the sky or a stone, was per impossibile uncaused, the sky or the stone would thereby be claimed to be alive. Finally, our concept of life is much clearer than our concept of being uncaused, but no one has ever tried to prove the creation of the world by appealing to the consequence that else it would be alive because being uncaused. Secondly, Hurtado's defense of perfection as a ground of life falls short of its stated intentions. It cannot provide a consistent account of why plants are alive or how the ground of life in plants is the same as the ground of life in God. Hurtado does not see that the concept of a perfection from within means two fundamentally different things when applied to plants and God. In the case of God, it means that we cannot assume any cause of a divine perfection. But all perfections a plant may have, like any perfection a stone may have, are caused by a cause. With regard to being uncaused, a plant is as dissimilar to God as it is similar to a stone. To be uncaused, improductus, can be understood as being opposed to caused by another substance, productus ab alio. Then God and plant both differ from stones because neither of them is caused by another substance. Or we understand uncaused as being opposed to caused by itself, productus a se. Then God and the stone are uncaused, but the plant is not, because the perfections of a plant are caused by the subject of these perfections, one could say reflexively. The root of the confusion lies in the fact that God is uncaused in a non-qualified sense, simpliciter. Hence, his mode of having perfections can be opposed to the perfections of both plants and stones. Something that is uncaused simpliciter thus agrees neither with living nor with non-living substances. This logical structure is ultimately based on the fact that to be alive is not a purely negative predicate when applied to plants. It implies that their life is self-caused. For God, this is not true, because causal predicates cannot be applied at all. Therefore, quote, God does in no way agree with the plant with regard to causality, therefore also not in the ground of life. This leads me to my conclusion. The intimate connection between Hurtado and Arriaga with regard to a proper understanding of life in plants and spiritual substances has not yet been noticed, presumably because both authors discuss the views of their opponent without attribution. In spite of the relatively obvious intertextual connections, there seems to be a marked difference in perspective that might deserve further study. The main emphasis in Arriaga's distinction between physical and intentional life lies on the defense of two different kinds of immanent changes, of which only one can count as a true act of life. His main concern in 1632 is thus a proper understanding of the distinction between changes in animate substances and changes in inanimate substances. In Hurtado, particularly in 1624, the main interest seems to be determined by rational theology. The final result of his analysis is a thesis about the divine life, namely that it is expressed in all of his attributes. In more general terms, any comprehensive analysis of the concept of life in the early modern period in general must cover the question how to conceptualize life not only for human viatores, but for an eternal life, as well as for the life of spiritual substances in general. There is no early modern philosophy of life without pneumatology. In this complicated field, Arriaga chooses the simple but radical solution. Both forms of life are incommensurable. We must therefore change our intuitive concept of life and understand it as an equivocal term that refers to different phenomena in the realm of plants and the realm of spiritual substances. For Hurtado, this move is merely an evasion. The philosopher faces the challenge to come to terms with the logical truth that both God and plants are species of the genus animate substance. Arriaga in turn objects that Hurtado's own solution disregards fundamental asymmetries between God and other living beings. Properties or perfections of a being in which there are no causes are fundamentally different from properties or perfections which are subject to causal influences. This asymmetry mirrors the more fundamental asymmetry between the grounds that are available to us, in each case, for the ascription of life, either to a plant or to God. Thank you.